Marcus Reed had not been on a date in 4 years, 2 months, and if he was being painfully precise about it, which he often was when he lay awake at 3 in the morning staring at the ceiling, 11 days. He knew the exact number because the last date he had been on was the evening before his wife, Serena, had been diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer. They had gone to a small Italian place on Fifth Street, the kind with red checked tablecloths and candles stuck into wine bottles, and they had laughed about something ridiculous their youngest had said that afternoon. He could not remember exactly what it was anymore, and that forgetting more than anything else was what gutted him on the lonely nights. Serena had been gone for 2 years now. The grief counselor, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Okafor who smelled perpetually of lavender, had told Marcus that there was no right timeline for healing. But Marcus's sister, Denise, apparently had her own timeline in mind, and it was aggressive. She had been nudging him toward the idea of dating again for the better part of 6 months, leaving articles about online dating apps open on his laptop when she came to babysit, texting him links to podcasts about love after loss, and eventually, 3 weeks ago, creating a profile for him on an app called Compass without so much as asking his permission. "You can be angry at me later," Denise had said, sitting cross-legged on his kitchen counter with her third cup of coffee, completely unbothered by his expression, which he imagined looked something like a man who had just discovered a stranger had rearranged all his furniture. "But there's someone on there I think you should talk to. His name is Daniel, he's a teacher, he seems kind." Marcus had looked at the profile Denise had set up for him. She had used a photo from last Thanksgiving, the one where he was laughing at something off camera and looked, he supposed, like a man who laughed regularly. In truth, he had laughed at the photo itself later when he was alone, because it felt like looking at a version of himself from a different life. 41 years old, father of 3, elementary school art teacher. These were the facts of his life, though they told nothing of the weight of them, of the morning routines that were now his alone, of the lunches packed with trembling hands, of the nights he sat on the bathroom floor after the boys fell asleep because it was the one room in the house where he could cry without anyone hearing. He had messaged Daniel anyway, not because he was ready, not because he believed in anything as luminous as a second chance at love. He had done it because his boys, Isaiah, 9, and the twins, Caleb and Micah, who had just turned 6, deserved a father who was at least trying. He had promised Serena that. He had whispered it into her hair the night before she died, while the machines beeped their steady indifference around them. "I'll keep trying," he had said. "I promise I will." The first few weeks of messaging with Daniel had been tentative, careful things, like learning to walk again after a long illness. Daniel was a single mother of triplets, a fact he had mentioned early and plainly, as though testing whether Marcus would flinch and disappear. Marcus had not flinched. He had 3 boys of his own. He understood, at least in part, what it meant to love children so completely that their existence restructured every decision you made. What he had not quite processed in the abstract warmth of text messages was what it would feel like when Daniel showed up at the restaurant with all 3 of his children in tow. They had agreed to meet at a place called the Blue Anchor, a family-friendly spot near the harbor that had booths large enough to accommodate people and their complications. Marcus arrived first, 15 minutes early, the way he always did when he was nervous about something. He sat in a corner booth and ordered water and tried to read the menu, though the words kept sliding away from him. He had worn the gray shirt that Isaiah had chosen for him that morning, standing in the closet doorway with the gravity of a stylist, saying, "That one, Dad. You look like a person in that one," which Marcus had found both helpful and slightly concerning. He was still studying the appetizers with counterfeit intensity when the door opened and the sound that came through it was immediately, unmistakably, the sound of children. He looked up, and there was Daniel Wass. Tall, dark-haired, with the kind of face that looked like it had been handsome for a long time and would continue to be handsome without particularly caring about it. standing just inside the entrance with his hands resting on the shoulders of two small people, while the third one pressed their face against the glass panel beside the door to look at something on the sidewalk outside. They were perhaps 4 years old, the triplets, and they were dressed in matching yellow sweaters that made them look like a set of living, breathing Easter decorations. Marcus set down the menu. He felt his chest do something complicated and slow, like a gear turning that had not been engaged in a long while. Daniel caught his eye across the room, and his expression shifted through something Marcus could not fully name, a combination of apology and defiance and hope, the way a person looks when they have done something bold that they are not entirely sure they should have done. He raised his hand in a small wave, Marcus raised his back, and then one of the triplets, the one at the glass, turned around and spotted Marcus sitting in the booth and pointed at him with great enthusiasm and said something to the other two that caused all three of them to look at him at once. Marcus, for the first time in 4 years, 2 months, and 11 days, felt a smile arrive on his face that was not something he had manufactured for someone else's comfort. It came from somewhere lower and older than his face. It came from somewhere he had thought was closed for good. Getting 3 4-year-olds settled into a restaurant booth was, Marcus observed, not unlike trying to organize a small tornado into a filing system. The triplets, whose names he would learn in rapid succession over the next several minutes, were Lily, Oscar, and the one who had pressed her face to the glass, Nora, had opinions about seating arrangements that were deeply held and aggressively expressed. Nora wanted to sit beside the window. Oscar wanted to sit beside Nora. Lily wanted to sit beside Oscar, but also beside her father, which created a geometric problem that took Daniel the better part of 3 minutes to solve with the calm efficiency of a man who had been solving geometric problems of this nature for 4 years. "I'm so sorry," Daniel said, the moment the children were positioned and the menus had been distributed, which the triplets held upside down with the serene confidence of people who were not troubled by this. I know this is not what you are expecting. Our babysitter canceled an hour ago. Her mother had a fall, which of course is serious and takes absolute priority, and I had no backup plan. And I considered canceling, I genuinely did, but I had already canceled twice before, and I didn't want you to think... He stopped, took a breath, looked at Marcus with eyes that were a particular shade of dark brown, steady and wary at once. "I should have called you first. I'm sorry." Marcus looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the 3 small people in the yellow sweaters, who were now examining their menus with varying degrees of upside-down seriousness, and at the way Daniel's hand hovered near the edge of the table, as though prepared to intercept any one of them at a moment's notice. He recognized that posture. He had lived in that posture for years. The constant, low-grade readiness of a parent alone in a public place with small children, always half a step ahead of the next small disaster, never fully relaxing, never fully sitting back in a chair. "It's fine," Marcus said, and meant it in a way that surprised him. "I have 3 boys. Isaiah is 9, and the twins just turned 6. I know what canceled babysitters look like." He paused. Also, for what it's worth, Nora's approach to the window seat negotiation was genuinely impressive. She made her case very clearly. Something in Daniel's shoulders released, so slightly that another person might not have caught it, but Marcus caught it because he knew that particular kind of release, the kind that happens when you are braced for judgment and receive grace instead. "She's going to be a lawyer," Daniel said, and it came out almost fond, the words worn smooth with repetition, the kind of thing a parent says about a child so often it becomes its own small prayer. The evening unfolded in a way that Marcus had not anticipated and could not have planned for. Lily spilled her apple juice within the first 10 minutes, a slow, spreading disaster that Daniel handled with a stack of napkins and the unruffled competence of a person for whom spilled liquids had long since ceased to be emergencies. Oscar decided he didn't like the kids' menu and wanted instead what Marcus was having, which was a grilled salmon with roasted vegetables, and spent the next 20 minutes negotiating this diplomatically with his father. Nora fell asleep sitting upright sometime between the appetizers and the main course, her head tipping slowly sideways until it rested against Daniel's arm, and Daniel shifted automatically, adjusting his angle to accommodate her without interrupting what he was saying, without even appearing to notice he had done it. Marcus noticed. He noticed all of it. The practiced ease of Daniel's hands, the way he kept his voice at the same measured pitch whether he was talking to Marcus or to his children, warm and consistent and unhurried. The way he laughed, which was quick and unguarded and lit up the upper half of his face. The way he looked at his children, with a love so matter-of-fact it didn't need to announce itself, the way sunlight doesn't announce itself, but simply is and changes everything by being there. "Tell me something about you that isn't in the profile," Marcus asked at one point, when Oscar had finally been persuaded that a single bite of Marcus's salmon was sufficient exploration, and Lily was engaged in drawing a picture on her children's activity platmat with crayons that saw better days. Daniel considered this with genuine seriousness, the way Marcus was beginning to understand he approached most things. "I cry at nature documentaries," Daniel said, "specifically the ones about migration. Something about the distances animals travel without knowing if they'll make it." He looked at Marcus. "And I make very good bread, from scratch. The boys had a whole phase where they refused to eat store-bought, and I panicked and learned, and now I can't stop." "The bread is actually a problem," Lily said without looking up from her drawing, and Marcus laughed so unexpectedly and so genuinely that Nora stirred briefly against Daniel's arm, and Oscar looked up at him with the frank, assessing look that children give adults they are not yet sure about, and Marcus held very still under it, the way you hold still under something that matters. It happened when the check had been paid and the coats were being gathered, and Oscar had discovered that his left shoe had somehow become untied during the meal, possibly twice. Daniel was kneeling on the restaurant floor tying Oscar's shoe while simultaneously speaking to Nora, who had woken from her brief upright sleep and was now in the particular emotional territory of the recently napped 4-year-old, which is to say she was 6 seconds from either joy or catastrophe, and the odds were even. Lily was standing beside Marcus, holding her drawing, a figure she had described as Daddy and the 3 of us and a dog, though they did not own a dog, and studying Marcus with the direct, unclouded attention that very young children deploy and adults spend their whole lives learning to dismantle. "Are you sad?" Lily asked. Marcus looked down at her. He had been smiling, he was fairly certain. He had been having the best evening he'd had in years, which was its own complicated truth. But children at 4 are not reading your face. They are reading something underneath your face, something that adults seal off from each other out of courtesy and protection. "Sometimes," he said, because she was 4 and she deserved honesty in a size that fit her. Lily nodded, as though she had suspected this. "Daddy is sad sometimes too," she said. "He thinks we don't know, but we do." She said this with the plain, factual confidence of someone reporting the weather. Then she looked at her drawing and looked back at Marcus and held it out to him. "You can have this," she said, "if you want." Marcus took the drawing. It was done in the mismatched colors that children choose when they are 4, and color by joy rather than by logic. A purple sky, a green figure for Daniel, 3 smaller figures in red and blue and yellow, and off to one side a large brown circular shape that was either the dog or the sun. It was hard to say. He held it and felt something inside his chest shift in a way that was almost physical, like a stone that had been lodged in a particular place for a long time and had just, quietly, moved. He did not realize until a moment later that his eyes were wet. He did not try to hide this from Lily, who was still watching him. "Thank you," he said, and meant it in more layers than a 4-year-old could parse, but some part of him needed to say anyway. Daniel stood up from tying Oscar's shoe and saw Marcus's face, and for a moment the restaurant noise and the children's voices and everything else fell away, and there was just the two of them looking at each other across the small geography of the table, with Lily between. They walked out into the cool September evening with Nora on Daniel's hip, and Oscar holding his father's other hand, and Lily walking between the two adults with the proprietary comfort of a child who has decided things are going the way she intended. Marcus had offered to walk them to their car, which was parked 2 blocks away, and the 2 blocks became 4 because Oscar spotted a lit-up toy store display in a window, and this required investigation. And then Lily found a crack in the sidewalk that needed to be jumped over exactly 3 times before it was done properly, and then Nora woke from her half-doze on Daniel's shoulder and demanded to be put down so she could walk, and then almost immediately changed her mind and demanded to be picked back up. Marcus had his hands in his pockets. It was getting cold. He was not thinking about the cold. He was thinking about how strange it was to be walking down a sidewalk in the evening with another adult and children, small bodies in bright coats, small voices discussing things of great importance, and to feel something other than loneliness in it. He had walked down this same street alone after Serena died. He had walked it with the boys. He had walked it pushing a stroller in the first weeks of new fatherhood, when the twins would only sleep if they were moving, and he had been so deep in the soft, exhausted cave of infant care that the world beyond the stroller's radius had barely registered. He had walked it in grief that was so total it felt like weather rather than emotion. Now he was walking it next to Daniel Voss, whose arm was warm where it occasionally touched Marcus's when the sidewalk narrowed, and the city felt like it had shifted a half-degree in some direction Marcus didn't have a compass heading for. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said. They had paused at a corner while Oscar and Lily debated the relative merits of a pigeon they had found sitting on a nearby ledge. Nora, returned to Daniel's hip, had fallen entirely asleep again, her head a warm, dense weight on his shoulder. "Sure," Marcus said. "Were you nervous? Tonight, before we arrived?" "Extraordinarily," Marcus said. "I read the appetizer menu 4 times. Daniel smiled at this. "Me too. I sat in the car for 10 minutes before I brought them in. I told myself a dozen times that this was a bad idea, that I should call you, make an excuse, try again some other night when there was a proper plan. But the truth is," he looked at the sleeping face of Nora against his shoulder, something passing through his expression that was private and enormous at once. "There is never a proper plan. There hasn't been, not since their father left. And I spent a long time pretending there would be, that I just needed more time to prepare, that someday the circumstances would be right, and I wasted so much time waiting for that." 3 months later, on a Saturday in December that arrived gray and cold and tasting of snow that hadn't fallen yet, Marcus made pancakes. This was not unusual. He made pancakes every Saturday, had done since the boys were small, had done even in the worst months when everything else about Saturday mornings was different and wrong and unbalanced, because the ritual of it, flour and eggs and the particular sizzle of butter in the pan, was something he could do with his hands that required just enough attention to keep the rest of his mind from wandering somewhere darker. What was unusual was that there were 6 plates on the counter instead of 4. Isaiah had noticed immediately, the way 9-year-olds notice everything when they suspect something is happening. He had come downstairs in his socks and his oversized sweatshirt and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, counting the plates with his eyes in the way Marcus recognized as his own habit transposed onto his son's face. And then he had looked at Marcus with the careful, searching look he had perfected over the last 2 years, the one that was really asking, "Is this okay? Is this safe? Are we still okay?" "Daniel is coming over, with his kids. I told you about them." He had told the boys about Daniel over the last 3 months in slow, careful installments, the way you introduce people to a temperature change, a little at a time, allowing for adjustment. He had told them there was someone he was spending time with. He had told them about the triplets, which had fascinated Caleb and Micah and prompted Isaiah to ask a series of quiet questions about whether this meant Marcus was replacing their mother, which had led to the most important conversation Marcus had had with his son in 2 years, the one where he explained that love was not a quantity that ran out, that Serena would always be theirs, that making room for something new in your heart was not the same as making room by removing something else. Isaiah listened with the gravity he brought to every serious thing, and then he had said, "Does he make you happy?" And Marcus, taken entirely by surprise by both the question and the clean truth of its answer, had said yes. Now the doorbell rang, and Caleb and Micah thundered toward the door with the combined force of 2 6-year-olds who had decided that whatever was on the other side of it was going to be interesting. Marcus wiped his hands on a dish towel and followed at a pace that was meant to be calm and was not entirely calm. Daniel stood on the porch in a dark coat, holding Nora's hand on one side and Oscar's on the other, while Lily stood slightly apart, wearing a hat that was too large for her, looking at the house with the expression of a small person who is committing everything to memory. They had brought something in a glass container covered in foil that smelled, even through the cold air, like cinnamon and something warm. Bread. Of course it was bread. He could not stop. For a moment, nobody moved. Marcus on one side of the threshold, Daniel on the other, 3 small people in winter coats between them and around them, and 2 6-year-olds somewhere behind Marcus vibrating with contained energy. The moment was very ordinary and completely impossible at once. Marcus thought of Serena, quickly and with love that had softened from the sharp thing it used to be into something that was still entirely present, but no longer only painful, the way old scars become part of your body's geography rather than just evidence of damage. He thought, I kept the promise. He thought, I am still trying. Caleb stepped forward from behind Marcus and regarded Oscar with the